And we are so happy to welcome here Candace Keynes, a women's historian and Mainer who's done all kinds of really exciting and incredible work around the history of women's activism in Maine. So we're here today to talk about Stand Up, Speak Out, and Organize, Maine's fight for women's rights. And I'm thrilled to get to kick this off the week before Mother's Day. Many people may know that Mother's Day has sort of a fun activist history, that it was really founded and created by women who were banding together to work for the right to have their children not sent off to war. It was by a group of female pacifists. So this feels like the right time to be having this conversation. Before I introduce Ms. Keynes, I just want to say for folks who are joining us here in the room or for people who are watching us on Facebook Live, I'm happy to have you. Ms. Keynes is going to go ahead and give her talk. You can ask questions. We will hold on to questions that you add into the chat or into the Facebook chat function. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A session. During the Q&A session, if you are in the Zoom room with us, then you're welcome to raise your hand and ask your question over the camera. Just know that your name, your image, and your voice will be broadcast over the Facebook live stream and recorded. If you don't want to do that, you can go ahead and put your questions into the chat, and I will be sure that, that we get to them. So I'm really excited for this conversation. And I'm happy to have you go ahead and introduce yourself and your topic today, Ms. Keynes. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. It's nice to be here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the history. I'm a historian, among other things, the history of some particular women's activism over rights in Maine. And hopefully it'll be an interesting kind of comparison to what's happening now, and also kind of enlightening about maybe where we've been and where we still might have to go. Let me do this. Okay. Sarah Ann Flint was born in 1794 in Strong, Maine. She was an unlikely person to bring about a significant in women's rights. She had married a man named Marquis de Lafayette Mace, who was known as Lafayette. I guess that was a popular name, Marquis de Lafayette. In 1816, 19 years later, in 1835, he suggested the family, which included a number of children, join the Sabbath Day Lake Shakers. Sarah agreed, but told him the decision was final. Once there, she wouldn't leave. Then in 1844, Fayette Mace decided to leave the Shaker community. Sarah, age 50, and at least some of the children remained. The couple had some property, which probably came from her family, that she wanted to get her portion, or what she saw as her portion of. Her husband apparently suggested that she petition the state to get it because, I'm not sure he said this, but because married women were not legally entitled to own property in 1844. On February 29th, 1844, while visiting her father in Farmington, Sarah dreamt the wording of a petition. She got out of bed and wrote what she had dreamt, then sent it to the legislature, asking them to grant married women the right to own property. She noted in her request that it was for the benefit of herself and her children. The legislature granted the right not just to Sarah Mace, but to all married women. On March 21st, 1844, less than a month after she sent her petition, the act to secure to married women their rights in property was passed. That might be one of the quickest turnarounds for legislation I've ever heard of. But anyway, Maine became at that point one of only a handful of states with laws, although many more passed married women's property acts in ensuing decades. 4 years earlier, The Maine legislature had passed a law that enabled married women to claim dower or widow rights and to engage in contracts as if they were unmarried. Married women lacked these and a number of other rights because of a legal principle called coverture. And here's what the principle means. When a man and a woman married, they essentially became one, and that one was the man. His rights, the theory went, covered her too. Even if a male relative left property to her, as in Sarah Mace's case, her husband controlled it until Sarah Mace had her dream and the legislature changed the law. But married women still lacked many rights, as did single women. Petitioning the legislature was the primary method until 1913 to get laws passed. Individuals and groups petitioned for charters to open schools or other institutions, to build roads or dams, to separate one town into two, to gain or limit fishing or water use rights, to appropriate money to hospitals or other entities, to be known by a different name, and so forth. Hundreds and hundreds of petitions every legislative session. In 1889, 45 years after Sarah Mace's petition, Elizabeth M. Allen, age 51, of Dresden, and it's interesting that they both did this when they were about 50, wrote to the legislature and, like Mace, asked for a right to benefit herself. She wanted to be able to vote in all elections. She laid out her qualifications, explaining and justifying why she should be able to vote. Quote, whether any or all other women desire or decline to vote, or petition that they or she may be hindered or not hindered from voting. Allen's effort, however, was not successful. The legislature ignored her pleas, as well as petitions that year signed by about 6,600 Mainers seeking the right for women to vote. While the principles of coverture sometimes got used as arguments against women's suffrage, people would say that, well, the man voted, the husband voted, and he could and should speak for the wife. So women didn't need the right to vote, but voting is different. And coverture was about married women, and voting was a right for both single and married women. And since single women didn't have the right to vote, coverture wasn't really applicable here, but it was still used as an argument. But suffrage was also difficult because it was so much more complicated to enact than Sarah Mace's simple petition to the legislature. For a little background, although you probably already know this, the US Constitution left the regulation of voting to states. All of the original states, except New Jersey, made it a right only for men who owned property or had some level of wealth. New Jersey, until 1806, included women among its voters, women who owned property. When Maine became a state in 1820, it adopted the language of the Massachusetts Constitution and permitted males aged 21 or older to vote for governor, senators, and representatives. They were called electors, not voters. Note that the Constitution doesn't mention president or any local offices. So in order for women to vote, either each state had to come up with legislation to allow it, or Congress had to pass a federal amendment. Maine women needed only legislative approval if they were going to local elections or for president, because those offices aren't mentioned in the state constitution. But a state constitutional amendment would be required for them to vote for governor or president. So amendments at both the federal and state level require 2/3 of each house of the legislature to vote to approve them. And then at the federal level, they have to be approved by 3/4 of the states. At the state level, in Maine, a referendum that gains a majority of voters would approve a constitutional amendment. So as you can tell, constitutional amendments are very difficult to achieve. Discussion of American women's rights and lack of rights began to gain traction on a pretty limited basis, but it started moving in the 1830s, largely as an offshoot of the anti-slavery movement. As women were involved in the abolitionist movement and talking about the lack of rights of enslaved people, they began to see similarities with their own lives. And then it grew with the Seneca Falls Declaration of Rights in 1848 and annual women's rights conventions every year from then until the Civil War. After the war, many of the women abolitionists, along with male allies, pushed for equal rights for the formerly enslaved persons and for all women. Those rights, some of those rights were included in 3 constitutional amendments that passed after the war. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, became law in December 1865. Then Congress passed the 14th Amendment, which is often called the Due Process or Equal Protection Amendment. But there's one section of it that is much less talked about. And that section punished states that denied voting rights to any male. It was the first time the word male appeared in the Constitution. Using that word and linking it to voting rights angered lots of people, including many of the women who were involved in these equal rights causes and had been for many years. Nevertheless, the amendment was ratified by enough states. The third constitutional, post-Civil War constitutional amendment is the 15th Amendment, which secured voting rights explicitly for Black men, leaving women, both Black and white, out of the picture. It was ratified in 1870. These amendments, along with conflicting ideas about race and class, as well as gender, whose rights and what rights were most urgent, what appropriate strategies were, caused one of many splinters in the equal rights and suffrage movements. They had splintered a number of times over strategies and other issues, but this was a huge split over how to proceed because of these amendments and even whether to support them. I thought that background might be useful to what I'm going to talk about next. And while it's really fascinating history that I could go on about forever, I won't, because that's really not my purpose right now. Rather, it's to give some examples from Maine's effort to gain rights for women, to highlight a couple of things that I think are especially interesting. One is the kinds of methods activists use to carry out the prolonged effort for women's suffrage in Maine, nearly 70 years in Maine, with virtually no victories along the way. 70 years of defeat. And how did they keep going? Second, I want to contrast the legislature's granting of various rights to women over that same period with their continued rejection of the right to vote. So to really think about what was the difference between the various kinds of rights that were being granted apart from suffrage, and why the rights movement, except for suffrage, was more successful than the suffrage movement itself. By the time Elizabeth Allen unsuccessfully petitioned the legislature to be able to vote, Maine women and men had been asking for that right for at least 35 years, starting in 1854, when Senator Thomas McCullough Hayes of Saco asked his fellow legislators to consider the issue. They did not. In 1857, for the first time, Mainers, along with national women's rights leaders, petitioned the Maine legislature and legislatures of other states at the same time, urging passage of women's suffrage. Between 1857, when petitioning started, and 1913, when petitioning was removed from the legislative process, women and men from all over the state petitioned the biennial legislature during at least 22 of the 28 sessions seeking voting rights for women. At least 12 formal bills were defeated from 1872 until 1917, when one finally passed. On those petitions, sometimes only a few per session, sometimes many dozens, were thousands upon thousands of signatures from men and women all over the state, sometimes from particular towns, sometimes from everywhere, but thousands and thousands of signatures. Some sought equal suffrage, which meant full suffrage rights, which would have required a state constitutional amendment. Some sought the vote in municipal elections, some in school elections, and neither of those would have required a constitutional amendment. Starting in about the late 1870s, women and men who opposed women's suffrage submitted competing petitions, or remonstrances, as they were often called. I'm going to come back to talk more specifically about the battles over suffrage and the people involved. But first, I want to talk about what rights women did gain during those years. From the time of Sarah Mace's plea in 1844, the legislature quite regularly passed various kinds of women's rights legislation, or tweaked rights it had already enacted. And it's challenging to talk about this because I hate to say that the legislature granted rights as though women didn't have a right to rights, which is why they're called rights. So pardon whatever language I use. Some of it I will put quotation marks around when I say it. Anyway, for instance, in 1852, the legislature amended the Married Women's Property Law to ensure that married women could not only own property, but could lease it, sell it, convey it, and dispose of it without any interference from their husband. And they also made sure that the law applied to all married women, even if they were under age 21. So if they were not of age but were married, they still had these rights. Interestingly, they also passed a number of laws over the years to protect men and their property from debts or contracts their wives might have incurred before marriage or in their own names afterwards. So once women started getting some of these rights, then men wanted to be protected from women adversely affecting the men's own credit rating or whatever. And some of those laws might seem more like men's rights than women's rights, but the laws, in fact, the way I look at it, also ensured that women could have financial autonomy. So it was further acknowledgement that women had financial autonomy and were seen as independent, married women as independent from their husbands. In 1857, the legislature passed laws detailing what happens to married women's property if they died intestate, essentially extending to them the same provisions that had applied always to men. They passed a law to enable women and minors to be witnesses in court. And it's really interesting looking at the laws over the years, how often women in these laws are coupled with minors or other dependent or people who are sort of lesser in legal terms than men. In the 1860s, the Civil War drew much of the state's attention, but women's rights legislation continued. Some of the changes relating mostly to who was and wasn't responsible for debts came about through petitions, but never on the same scale as the ones for women's suffrage. Going through the petition process was minor, I think, compared to what women's suffrage endured. And it's interesting because legislators could also introduce things that they wanted the legislature or legislative committees to consider. So I think that many of the women's rights bills that came about were introduced by legislatures on behalf of other parties, legislators. The legislature during these years also defeated some women's rights measures, allowing married women to control certain trusts, exempting all women from arrest and imprisonment for debt, which I thought was an interesting idea, creating a reformatory only for women. And they defeated that despite a plea that noted the enlightened moral sentiment of society demands a considerate treatment of women, even when they incur the penalties of the law. In 1863, the legislature granted Westbrook Seminary in Portland the right to offer a course of study for young ladies equivalent to that of any female college in New England and grant degrees. It also passed the Normal School Act the same year, and a year later, the Farmington Normal School, which is a school for teacher training, opened to women and men. It was the first in the state. In 1872, the legislature passed a law that enabled women to attend the Maine College of Agriculture and Mechanic Arts, which became the University of Maine. In 1875, Governor Nelson Dingley recommended that the legislature pass a law allowing women to be clerks in public or private offices, administer oaths, take acknowledgement of deeds, and solemnize marriages. The Judiciary Committee recommended against those rights, but the full legislature approved them. And one of the reasons that he recommended that was that in 1874, the Maine Supreme Judicial Court ruled that women could not hold any offices or jobs that were mentioned in the Constitution unless the legislature specifically permitted them to do so. That's why it's important what the Constitution says. Also in the 1870s, the legislature passed a law that allowed married women to prosecute and defend lawsuits in their own names. And they said it was in order to preserve and protect their property and personal rights. Over the years, the legislature also raised the age of protection, sometimes known as the age of consent, for girls from 10 to 13 in 1887, then to 14 in 1889, and instituted qualified protection for girls ages 14 to 16 in 1897. In the 1880s, Maine women were permitted to hold offices such as school supervisor or superintendent. And throughout the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, following national trends, working hours for women, who were usually coupled with underage boys and girls, were gradually reduced to 60 hours a week, then to 58, and then 54, and then they kept going down. The legislature in 1889, and this is partly in response to the 1874 Supreme Judicial Court ruling that I mentioned a few minutes ago, passed a law that clarified that no occupations were denied to Maine women by law. They on other grounds, but not by law. As the 20th century loomed, women were allowed to control their own bank accounts and be appointed as guardians without their husband's consent. Another law clarified that deposits made by a married woman or a minor was that person's property, not that of a husband or parent. In 1899, the legislature passed a law that enabled women to practice law, but they were somewhat behind the times. 27 years earlier, in 1872, Clara Hapgood Nash of Columbia Falls was admitted to the bar and practiced law along with her husband. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court said he examined her qualifications, found her qualified, and knew of no law that would prevent him from admitting her. And there may have been, she's the first woman lawyer in Maine that I know of, and there probably were other women lawyers before 1899 when it became legal, but I don't know about them. That litany of laws regarding women's rights in Maine up to the time they got the right to vote shows the variety of rights women lacked and needed legislative approval to acquire, and the ways that society thought about women during those years. And you can kind of see some gradual changes in perhaps how society, or at least the legislature, thought about women. And now a brief look at the long fight for women's voting rights. Among the activities that activists undertook during the 70 years it took from the first mention in the legislature until women got the right to vote in Maine, activists lectured, engaged lecturers to speak, lobbied legislators, lobbied other people in the community, educated people in the community, endlessly petitioned the legislature, attended hearings, formed organizations, trained other women in lobbying, fundraising, speaking, garnered male allies, and so forth. One of the earliest Maine women's rights talks that we know about was by John Neal of Portland. Neal was an author, an art critic, a lawyer who delivered the city's July 4th address in 1832. He told the crowd that women were not really free because they had to pay taxes, but essentially had no representation because they were denied to vote. Exactly the same argument that Americans had made in splitting away from Great Britain: no taxation without representation. He also helped organize a women's suffrage group in Portland in the 1830s or 1840s, but the group didn't last very long. And he was key in initiating a gathering in Augusta in 1872 that led to the formation of the Maine Women's Suffrage Association, which would be very crucial in the coming decades to finally gaining some traction for women in being allowed to vote. Perhaps it was his twin sister or his mother who raised the two children after his father died, who influenced his views and made him a very active women's rights proponent. In 1855, Sarah Jane Lincoln O'Brien of Cornish invited Lucy Stone, a prominent abolitionist and women's rights advocate, to speak in Cornish. During that visit, Stone also gave several other speeches around Maine. O'Brien herself remained active in suffrage causes, including as a founding member and longtime officer of the Maine Women's Suffrage Association. And she was active until her death in 1904 at age 83. She, like many of her fellow activists who I'm going to tell you about, never gave up, but died without having achieved their goals and being able to vote. 2 years after O'Brien started this speaking program in southern Maine, in 1857, Anne F. Jarvis Greeley and her sister Sarah Jarvis of Ellsworth, along with Charlotte Hill of Gouldsboro, all three known for abolitionist, temperance, and women's rights views, appointed themselves as a committee and organized a speaker series in Ellsworth. Among those who came were Wendell Phillips, who was a well-known abolitionist, suffrage advocate and abolitionist Susan B. Anthony, and feminist reformer named Carolyn Healy Dahl. The speakers drew sizable crowds and a lot of newspaper coverage, which helped to spread the rights message throughout the state. And that's just a small example of the hundreds of speeches that were given over this period on women's suffrage throughout Maine. Greeley had owned a millinery and dry goods shop in Ellsworth from age 20 and kept it operating after her marriage and while raising her daughter. After her death in 1914, an obituary noted, "She had not only clear and well-seasoned opinions, but a strong mind, a vigorous vocabulary, and a quick wit. The side of the right she took with a man's courage and a woman's flow of language." Greeley also wrote numerous persuasive and rather forthright newspaper pieces under the pen name Key Est. Charlotte Hill, who was the other, besides her sister, the other member of this committee, wrote opinion pieces under the pen name Dirigo. Hill, who remained single, was a violinist and taught music and dance. After attending what she thought would be a hearing on women's suffrage at the State House in 1875, Hill wrote, "More influential than woman, though unacknowledged as such by the average legislator of states and nations, even the insignificant lobster finds earnest champions where woman's claims fail of recognition. The legislators ignored suffrage petitions, but took up what she called the lobster question." She wrote, "After the morning hour, a dozen ready debaters sprang to their feet, eloquent in advocating the rights of this important member of the crustacean family. The discussion waxed into something like enthusiasm, when finally an old tar exclaimed with terrific violence, 'Mr. Speaker, I insist upon it. This question must be considered. It is a great question, one before which all others will sink into insignificance, one of vastly more importance than any other that will come before this honorable body during this session.'" Suffrage may have failed in 1875, but Hill certainly got some people's attention. In 1868, Rockland sisters, Lavinia and Lucy Snow, along with their elder sister, Elvira Snow Thorndike, who lived in California and was active in suffrage groups there, started the Rockland Equality League, the state's first post-war suffrage group. The sisters continued to promote the suffrage cause through lectures, petitions, and participation in state and national organizations. They were very well known nationally. Lucy Snow died in 1912. Her obituary noted, "She never wavered in her espousal to women's suffrage and happily lived to see 6 states enfranchise its women, but regretted that her native state still held them in bondage," as she expressed it. Her sister Lavinia was quoted as saying, "I well recall the feeling of degradation that seized upon me when my younger brother arrived at the age of 21. That he should have a voice and a ballot while I, at least his intellectual equal, should be condemned to silence and political inaction was deep injustice that I have never been reconciled to." Lavinia died in 1917, weeks before a suffrage march in Washington that she planned to attend. Many other local organizations popped up after the Civil War all over the state, and especially after the Maine Women's Suffrage Organization began in 1872. Some of them lasted for many years as well. Also in 1872, the chairman of the Legal Reform Committee that was supposed to review a woman's suffrage petition in the legislature, David Barker of Exeter, reportedly said the matter ought to be treated seriously and that he had already, this is before any hearing or discussion, prepared a report in the form of a poem. "Yes, let them meet us at the polls, though dressed in gown and jacket. If they can stand our sordid souls, we'll try to stand their racket." The new statewide group clearly had a lot of work to do. Throughout the 1870s, the groups came and went, and like the national groups, who were advocating for women's rights had periods of inactivity for a variety of reasons, especially in the late 1870s through much of the 1880s. That did not stop petitioning efforts, however, and it did not stop lectures and other activity. In 1883, Governor Frederick Roby said in his address to the opening of the legislative session, "The question of giving the women of our state the right of suffrage on all occasions, at least the practicability of removing many restrictions, is in keeping with justice and progress made by other states and worthy of favorable legislation." In response, the legislature held a hearing concerning the many petitions it received that year. One state senator opposed the bill because voting would, quote, break up homes. Others said polling places were not fit for women to enter. A senator from Bath replied that the sooner they were made fit, the better. But finally, legislators that year told the women at the hearing that they would have to convince the legislature that they really represented the women of Maine because legislators did not believe that most women wanted to vote. That was a very common argument. Well, thank you for your testimony, but we know women don't really want to vote because I talked to my wife and she doesn't want to vote. Legislators may have underestimated the conviction of pro-suffrage forces. 12 years later, in 1895, they received petitions with about 10,000 signatures seeking the vote for women, most asking for municipal suffrage. And that was one of many years that anti-suffrage forces also presented petitions. On February 2nd, the Judiciary Committee held a hearing. Women arrived in winter by train, by horse and buggy, by any means they could find from every county in Maine. It took some 4 or 5 days to reach Augusta, and they, proponents and opponents, so jammed Representatives Hall that there was no room for the members of the Judiciary Committee when they arrived to conduct the hearing. Lillian Stevens, head of the Maine Women's Christian Temperance Union and active in Maine Women's Suffrage Association. She was an officer of the association for dozens of years, was the MC of the day. Before the hearing began, she said to the mobbed room, "Ladies, stand aside and give the men their rights." That brought laughter, and then the Judiciary Committee could get into the room. Then she said, "For 20 years past, have the women come up to the state's legislature and ask that the franchise be extended to them. They have biennially presented their claims and have as regularly been forced to, in disappointment, away." 2 years ago, she said, "we were met with the old argument that no considerable portion of the women of Maine want the ballot. We who came then were told that it would be better for our claims should we have the state represented by women from every section if we wanted to prove that we really want the ballot. Gentlemen, we have come." It was, by all accounts, the largest crowd for a hearing at the State House in many years, if ever. But once again, the legislature rejected the proposed change in voting laws. This illustration is from the Lewiston Journal, and it accompanied a lengthy article about the hearing. And there were lots more illustrations that went with it. I don't know if you can see the center of it says, "Maine women have a word with the elephant." Arguments against women voting included that men spoke for women with their vote, that politics was too nasty for fragile and gentle women, that women had more influence without the vote, that women were too emotional to vote, that women's entry into politics would ruin the family, cause her to neglect her husband and children, and sully her reputation. And of course, that most women didn't want to vote. Voting was a burden. And some of the antis argued that voting was too much of a burden. They already had too much to do and they couldn't take on another job. Proponents argued that women would clean up politics, considered the well-being of women and children, that women were involved in business, trade, farming, teaching, factory work, and numerous other jobs, and that they were as smart and knowledgeable as men. They also argued that as citizens, they should have equal rights. Those women who didn't want the vote could stay home on election day and didn't need to deny others their right to participate, they said. And of course, proponents cited the no taxation without representation argument that John Neal spoke about in 1832, excuse me, that Anne Jarvis Greeley petitioned the town of Ellsworth about in the 1870s, and that women from across the state petitioned the legislature about in 1899, all to no avail. Hannah Johnston Bailey of Winthrop, a native of New York State, who was a notable figure in national Quaker organizations and in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and who ran her husband's oilcloth and rug manufacturing business in Winthrop after his death, stated the issue eloquently at the 1895 hearing. "I never pay my taxes, but what I feel like protesting against taxation without representation. And I have thought of paying them on the installment plan so as to protest as often as possible." In 1890, the two national suffrage organizations that had existed for 2 decades merged and revitalized themselves as the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Having a national strategy and a unified voice helped spur activity in the states, including Maine. Still, there were many disagreements, both nationally and in Maine, about approach and the message. In Maine, in 1913 seemed like the year that the legislature would finally approve a suffrage bill, but it did not. When it finally did pass a suffrage bill in 1917, the activism in Maine shifted to securing passage of the referendum required to change the Maine Constitution, with, of course, only men allowed to vote. Despite speeches given all over the state, national field workers organizing and aiding the effort, suffrage schools to train supporters, a blast of campaign materials, and signatures of supporters gathered in nearly every single community in every county. And those signatures were published in newspapers, posted on store windows. Nevertheless, the male voters of Maine defeated the measure 2-1. The failure was attributed to the short time between legislative approval and the vote, because Maine then held its primaries in September, and so in March and or April, and the primaries were held in September. So also lack of organizing in rural areas, but the primary reason for its defeat, many thought, was that between the passage of the bill and the vote, the US entered what became known as World War I. The nation's attentions and demands on women were elsewhere. And the National Women's Party, you may have read or seen Iron-Jawed Angels, picketed the White House to get President Wilson to support women's suffrage, a controversial tactic, especially in wartime. And many Maine men said, that's why we're not voting for suffrage, or at least that's what was reported. So Maine women got the vote after Congress passed the 19th Amendment in 1919. With considerable pressure from women suffrage groups, Maine became the 19th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. Maine women, along with those in other states, began voting in 1920. Of course, there were then, as there are now, those who were denied the vote despite the constitutional provision. Many Black women, some immigrants, not in Maine. Maine never prohibited Blacks from voting. Some immigrants, some paupers, Native Americans in general, who were not considered citizens in the United States until 1924 and couldn't vote in Maine until another constitutional amendment was passed in 1956. And sort of ironically, many Black men who seem to have gained the right to vote by virtue of two constitutional amendments were often denied voting rights by 1920 and still by Jim Crow laws and practices. So back to my question, why was the legislature willing to pass a variety of women's rights issues and yet under considerable pressure to do so, unwilling for so many years to, quote, allow women to vote on any level? And I'll be interested in your thoughts about this, but one explanation is probably that the first two notable women's rights actions the legislature considered were dower rights, ensuring that widows got some means of support, and married women's property rights. So both provided economic security to married or widowed women. Without that security, the widows or wives or their offspring finding themselves in economic straits would be dependent on the city or town in which they lived. So going back to colonial times, towns were responsible for the support of indigent people who lived there. And like today, many resented those costs. And so giving women rights, economic rights within marriage or as widows was actually to the benefit of the town as a whole, because they then wouldn't have to take care of these women or children. So in addition, women's property usually came from within their family, though occasionally husbands left property to women. So, so that also helped families keep property within the family. Allowing married women to control their wages, likewise, could help keep them financially, their wages or other money they earned independently, could keep them financially independent. Coverture, remember, applied only to married women. Single women already had rights to own property and control their own income. But voting, apparently, presented a more existential threat to something or things larger than the pocketbook. To authority, to power. It has always been a hotly contested right, and as we know, still remains so. The author of the newspaper article about the 1895 crowd of women at the State House demanding the vote wrote, "One Solon told me that if the women would stop at municipal suffrage, it would be all right to grant it. But there's just the darn of it," said he, with a wrinkling of his brow and a slanting dicular wipe of his forefinger through the atmosphere. "They won't stop there, but will want to be speaker, legislator, governor even." And then the reporter, speaking as if he were the legislator, said, will you really, dear ladies? If some of us thought you meant to achieve all that, wouldn't we office seekers feel nervous? What uses would we have for our boxes of cigars, crackers and cheese, etc., on campaigning tours? "Let's see," muses the Solon. "We'll have to think this over a little." While the reporter was making fun of the lawmaker was serious. Despite changes in women's roles throughout the 19th century, more and more women working in factories, offices, operating their own businesses outside of the family economy, getting educations, including at college, pushing their way into medical schools and other types of professional training, riding bicycles, somehow voting was going too far. Too much freedom. Social and economic changes did not equate with political or civic changes. This brief look at women's rights agitation in Maine perhaps offers an opportunity to think about what types of rights are women's rights, how those categories have and haven't changed over the years, why some rights are more difficult to achieve than others, and what all of that might mean today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful conversation. I feel like it was also really soothing after a tough day at the State House to hear that sort of march through history. I have a few questions of my own, but I won't dominate the space. I'd love to hear if other people here have questions or thoughts that came up for you while you were listening to this. Or if you have responses to Ms. Kane's question about why not voting.
I just wanted to say how much I love the lobster story.
No, it's my very favorite. I absolutely love it.
Right. I know sometimes it takes people a minute to get warmed up. I guess one of the things, while people in the space think about their conversation, and also I should say we're still on Facebook Live. So if you are watching us on the Facebook live stream and you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We will make sure that we bubble those questions over to this space. And if you are here in the Zoom room with us, you can put your questions in the chat, or you're welcome to speak up through your voice or your cam. Just know that the image and sound is on Facebook Live. The question, though, one of the things that came up for me while other folks are thinking of questions is just, we see how powerful, I should say, even though a lot of people don't exercise their right to vote, and a number of people actually don't feel that their right to vote is terribly powerful, or that voting does matter as much as it does, we can see the power in voting because we see how the powers that be try to undermine it, strip it away, take it away, create barriers. And we're seeing, we saw that then through everything that you just talked about, and we're seeing it right now.
And I guess that's part of, what strikes me about this story is what, how threatening voting is.
Right.
How threatening expanding the right to vote is, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Not just today. I mean, we think of today as, the whole world, but, when you look back at all these years and the responses that the women got and some of the dismissals, sort of the little poem and things like that, you realize it is threatening to organize and get the vote.
Right. Pam, did I see you with your hand up? Great.
When I hear stories about what was happening in Maine with women's suffrage or Indigenous women, or just the whole stories of women in Maine, it always makes me wonder, were Mainers ahead of their time in terms of what we were doing to either get the vote or the other things that women were denied? So were we ahead of our times, or right there with pretty much the rest of the country?
Well, I think certainly the Married Women's Property Act was one of the earliest ones, but the suffrage things were going on across the country, and it was different in different states. What happened and how organized people were, and what the legislatures were like. And women out west got the vote. Many got the vote before women in the East. The East Coast was behind everything. But that didn't mean that the activists were behind the times. It was the legislators. But I think Maine women were certainly ahead in some things, but I think we were right there with what was going on elsewhere. I'm not an expert on every other states, but from what I've read and heard. But they're still impressive, whether I think, some of these stories about what they did, what women did. And when you look at how people described some of the activists in obituaries, you realize how powerful they really were, how powerful the women really were.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
One of the questions I had earlier was when you were talking about the various amendments, I think the 14th and perhaps another one, it's always a conversation with conservative women about why they don't feel the need for the ERA because of those amendments. And so I'm always curious, was that really enough if we were enforcing it, or is there some merit to pushing for the ERA?
Well, I see Posey Cowan is on here. She might have an answer to that because I know she's very active in the ERA. But I don't think those amendments do the same thing that the ERA does. And, as we saw in Maine, the law, the way the legislature the Supreme Judicial Court interpreted the law that women could not do these things unless there was specific legislation, I think tells part of the story. I see Posey. Do you want to say something, Posey?
Yeah, hi. Pam, will you ask your question one more time?
What I had said was that I know there's always a conversation going on between conservative and liberal women about the ERA versus is it the 14th or whatever amendment it is. 14th. We don't need ERA because of that amendment.
Right.
So I haven't been well versed enough to have a decent argument. So I was curious as to are those amendments enough, or do we need to keep working to pass the ERA?
Right. The problem with the 14th Amendment, that issue is always thrown up, is that the way it was designed is it doesn't protect women at the same level as people who have race or religion. So it has to do with scrutiny, and there are different legal terms, but what it means basically is if there's a sex discrimination case against women, they have to prove the intent of the person that they intended to discriminate. So it's very hard to prove those cases. Whereas if it's a race case or an ethnic case, it's the person who's discriminating that has to prove that they weren't intentionally discriminating. So we are not, the 14th Amendment does not basically protect us from discrimination at the same level as other categories are. So it's really critical that there is an equal rights amendment. And thanks for asking that question. And Candace, thank you. I know a lot about sort of the history of suffrage, but not specifically in Maine. So that was really fun to hear that.
Great.
So we are coming up on our time. If there are any last questions, I'm happy to hear from folks. This is your moment to put your hand up or flag us. But otherwise, I'm so grateful to you to come help us. Oh, do I see a hand?
No, that's okay. Thank you.
All right. I'm grateful to you, Candace, for joining us this afternoon. I learned a lot. I hope that other folks did too. I also want to lift up that this was part of the Maine Humanities Council World in Your Library series. And we're really grateful to the council for allowing us to participate in this series and making this possible. So thanks to all of the great staff at the Humanities Council. I see that Dania has dropped the website in there. You can also find out more about the Women's Lobby work. We are very busy these days. So go check out what we are up to at the Maine Women's Lobby website at mainewomen.org. I hope you'll go visit our testimony archive or some of our other work. We are planning right now our biennial summit on Maine women's economic security with keynote speaker Latasha Brown. that will focus on the intersection of gender equity and racial equity and democracy access. So it feels like a really great sort of nexus with this conversation here. So I hope that everybody here will join us in October for that conversation as well. Thank you so much, Ms. Keynes, and I
You're
am
welcome.
able to do this.
It was great. Thanks. Thanks everybody for attending. And nice to see you, Posey.
All right, big round of applause. Thank you. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.